представителей Юго-Востока Украины.
We call on the representatives of southeastern Ukraine, the supporters of the federalization of the country, to postpone the referendum planned for May 11th this year.
В мае текущего года
мировое сообщество, выражаясь модным термином.
Once again gathering in the same format, when the opposition to the current regime in Ukraine is absent from the negotiating tables. This will hardly change anything. It's possible to continue on this path, of course, but we will just go around in a circle and once again speak about how everything that we've agreed on needs to be implemented.
По кругу и будем опять.
And also ask the partners to make everything possible to eliminate the external threat and provocations supported by Russia in Ukraine to allow these elections to take place in a free and democratic way.
As President Obama has made clear, if Russian elements continue to sabotage the democratic process and prevent Ukraine from holding a free and fair election 19 days from now on the 25th, then we stand ready to implement additional sanctions. And the we is Europe and the United States together. I know the European Union is strong in its commitment to do this.
Hello there and welcome to another edition of Between the Lines. I'm Sergeant Preradovic. While Ukraine is teetering on the brink of an all-out civil war, the government in Kiev, backed by the US and the EU, is pushing ahead with its so-called anti-terrorist operations against pro-Russian activists in the east of the country. Meanwhile, the Kremlin is coming under increasing pressure to come to the aid of ethnic Russians as the death toll continues to climb. So what's next for Ukraine, and what will it mean for the geopolitical aspirations of both Russia and the West? To discuss this further, let's bring in our guests for tonight. In the studio, I'm now joined by Dr. Jennifer Skulte-Ouaiss. She is a professor at the Lebanese American University in Beirut. In London, we have Charles Shoebridge. He is a security analyst. And last but by no means least, Manuel Oschenstreiter. He is a Berlin-based journalist. A warm welcome to everyone. Dr. Skulte, I'd like to begin with you here. Dozens have been killed across Ukraine over the past couple of weeks. Is this the beginning of a much broader conflict, do you think?
I'm sure that most people hope that it's definitely not. However, as the interim president of Ukraine noted just last week, it seems that the eastern part of the country has really fallen out of the control of Kiev. And then at the same time, the statements that came out of Moscow late this afternoon about Putin saying, please, we're going to ask that the referenda scheduled for this weekend be postponed. I think there's a certain sense that we're just on the brink and may indeed, with the events in Odessa, have already passed into something that will be hard to turn around. Okay,
Manuel, one of the points made there, Putin's comments today, asking for a delay in that referendum for the future status of those eastern regions. Is that Russia backing down?
No, I don't think so. But I think what is one of the more important messages that President Putin was giving today was that he wants to talk, that he wants a dialogue, that he wants to negotiate with Kiev. And as I know, so this was the latest news when I read this, that Kiev rejected the offer from Russia. And because of your first question, I strongly think that Ukraine will swift into a sort of war. If this will be just a civil war, who knows? I think we are right now already at the edge of a proxy war taking place, of a geopolitical proxy war, as we see it, for example, in Syria, where we have the same front lines and almost the same players. So this might happen also in Ukraine. And the problematic point for Europe is that Ukraine is a European country. It's much closer.
Mr. Shoebridge, what are your thoughts on that, and how successful would you say that this Kiev's anti-terrorist operation in the east of the country has been up to this point?
Well, it hasn't been successful, and I think in the long term, nor can it be successful. The situation is that although in terms of brute force, the Ukraine armed forces are capable, of course, of crushing resistance. Let's face it, although some of the pro-Russian separatists or activists are armed with relatively modern weapons, the vast majority are not. They're armed with basic rudimentary weapons such as shotguns, slingshots, even and petrol bombs. So they will be crushed quite quickly in a purely military perspective, shall we say. But the problem is what comes next for Ukraine. Do they really intend that they will then keep these eastern provinces under military occupation effectively, which would be very expensive for them? Will that then prompt some form of guerrilla warfare, perhaps even what we might call terrorism, from the people who currently have been trying to express themselves in terms of standing up to the Ukraine government as they see it, but can't take them on militarily? And to answer the first part of your question, I would say that the future of this conflict is very much in the hands of the US and the EU on one hand and Russia on the other. If they wish to militarize further this situation, perhaps by providing arms to either or both of the sides, then indeed I think what your previous contributors have said is correct, that we could be on the brink here of a much more serious confrontation.
Dr. Skulte, what are your thoughts on that? Is this a proxy war going on?
I don't think that it's a proxy war yet. I think it's a proxy war of words, perhaps, but in terms of what's going on the ground thus far, I think we are seeing many pro-Russians. That's pro-Russian Ukrainians with also Russian citizens, probably Russian special ops on the ground, and then from the Kiev side, unfortunately, a lot of inept police and military responses, and a real reservation to go in hard into eastern Ukraine.
Russia has blamed a lot of the recent violence, especially the latest incidents in Odessa, which left over 40 pro-Russian activists dead there, on far-right neo-Nazi groups.
I think that's a small part of it, but again, unfortunately, Russia pointing to that, the anti-Semitic, Western, the rhetoric on both sides, unfortunately, has increased so much, and fascist this, fascist that, that I think it's far overstating what the real fascist component of the pro-Kiev supporters are.
Manuel, do you agree with that? How big of a role would you say that these far-right groups like Pravi Sector and others are playing on the ground in eastern Ukraine?
I mean, we should take a very, very close look. Who is right now building and backing the Kiev government? And because of your question, if we can speak about a proxy war, I'm completely with Jennifer, not now, but we have to say that the Ukrainian government, the so-called government of Kiev, is a proxy government. It is backed by the West. It is the wishful government of the European Union and of the US. And how is it built? It is built by liberal oligarchs. It is built by economic criminals, and we have a militia of hooligans and of terrorists. We have also to tell that term that we speak about terrorists, why I will explain now. So those people form this government, and those people are trying to keep that state, this entity, Ukraine, which is right now already a disintegrated, failed state. It's an empty entity right now. There is no Ukrainian state anymore. There's no control about the East. They just can keep the control on their cities in the West. So they sent those troops, those infantry, this illegal infantry of Pravi Sector, for example, but many other groups as well, into those cities. When we look at the right sector, it deserves a close look, because we have there not just football hooligans or violent groups inside. We have there also international terrorists. One of them, he was killed several weeks ago. He was one of the leading heads of the right sector. He fought alongside in the Chechenian wars, alongside Chechenian Islamist terrorists against the Russian. Other people of the Pravi sector, they fought already, for example, in the Georgian-Russian war on Georgian side. So these people are very high-skilled, violent terrorists who are active there. And this shouldn't be silenced. This should be told also to the people. So we have to see it also from that perspective, what is going on. And that, of course, in eastern and southern Russia, I have been on Crimea during the referendum. Of course, the people there are deeply worried about what is coming there from Kiev.
But I think that you also have to look, when you were describing the criminal elements among the pro-Kiev people, for a second I thought that you were describing actually what's going on among many of the Russian supporters. I mean, the documented criminality of a lot of the people that are engaging in the activities in Donetsk, in Mariupol, in Luhansk, in Sloviansk, has been shown all around. The importation of fighters from Chechnya on the part of the Putin-backed leader in Chechnya, I think is highly problematic. I would say the Ukrainian side is more inept with a component that is fascist, but really a lot of the problems that we see inside of eastern Ukraine today wouldn't be there without the agitation and support and instigation of Putin's government.
Manuel, your response to that?
I'm now completely surprised where Chechnyan terrorists are fighting alongside the eastern and southern Ukrainian People's Defense Forces. This is very new for me. Sorry. Can you maybe answer it? I never heard about that.
Dr. Skulte?
Well, I mean, what I was reading today is that Karimov, I think the leader, the Putin-installed leader in Chechnya, has been recruiting and pushing to recruit people to fight on behalf of the Russian state, acting as pro-Russian supporters in eastern Ukraine.
Well, Dr. Skulte, one of the points that Manuel made there about the legitimacy of the government in Kiev, I mean, a lot of what we've seen in the last couple of weeks does suggest that that government does lack legitimacy.
I would fully agree, and that's why I think it's so important that we call it the interim government, and I think that that's why, despite all the unrest, that elections really need to take place when they're scheduled on May 25th so that a more legitimate government can be put in place. I don't see how postponing those elections can help to decrease the very real violence against pro-Russian supporters in a number of places and against the interim Kiev government or pro-Ukrainian supporters.
Mr. Shoebridge, I want to bring you into this discussion here. The government in Kiev is actually building up the National Guard that would be independent of the military and the police. That's headed by Dmitry Yarosh. He is the Pravi sector leader, the far-right neo-Nazi group. But what does that tell us about the level of support that the Kiev government has?
Well, it tells us a number of things. First of all, it tells us that there are concerns that, and these have been around for some time. Indeed, I tweeted this very comment myself a couple of months ago as soon as this, if you like, private militia was announced. And that is that it signifies that there is a lack of trust from the Ukraine government in the armed forces and the police of Ukraine in supporting the government's objectives and its, if you like, its agenda. And indeed, that has been proved to have come to pass, of course, where in the eastern provinces, the police and the army, the regular local army, have indeed refused to take up arms against their fellow countrymen in the east, or worse, as far as Kiev is concerned, have actually defected and joined the separatist movement. On the other hand, of course, it also shows that there is considerable power within not just the pro-Maidan demonstrators that deposed Yanukovych and, of course, brought this current government to power. Within those groups, it was well known, I think, as a matter of fact, that the far right held considerable influence and took a very influential part in overthrowing Yanukovych beyond what their numbers would suggest. But further than that, they also have considerable positions of power within the government itself. So, for example, the Chief Prosecutor's Office, certain positions within other parts of government, particularly in relation to Justice and Interior Ministry, are also in far-right hands, beyond what certainly opinion polls at the moment would suggest. Svoboda, for example, would actually have as its influence within a new government in terms of its opinion polling. It's also worth pointing out that the elections, of course, are only presidential. They will not be necessarily forming a new government as a result of this. The government that is in power has been appointed by a parliament that is, if you like, a shadow of its former self. It's really questionable, I think, to the degree to which a parliament which repeatedly, in the early days especially, was returning unanimous votes, that was surrounded by right sector and other militias that were guarding the parliament building, but could also be called intimidation. It's questionable the degree to which the votes that were carried out that formed this government were in any way democratic or accountable. And that fundamentally undermines the credibility of this government, and that may undermine it even going forward, notwithstanding this presidential election.
Manuel, even pro-NATO, if you will, Western press reports, including the German Bild, are now reporting that there are dozens of CIA and FBI agents running the show in Kiev. What do you make of those?
Yes, because it's simply true. The simple point is, when you were mentioning the Bild-Zeitung, that they report about this, but they don't see that as a scandal. They say, why shouldn't... This is how, by the way, the German mainstream media generally is writing about those things. If it's about the NSA scandal in Germany, or if it's now about CIA agents, masses of military advisors and CSI agents in Ukraine, that they say, why shouldn't they do this? The Russians do this as well. So we have a little bit the old Cold War rhetorics coming back, having a huge revival now in Germany. Yes, of course, they are there, and they are there since a long time in Ukraine. And I'm convinced that what happens now, that those events taking place now since fall last year, that this is quite good prepared. I was doing some researches, especially about the role, for example, of German NGOs and German political foundations, how they were supporting and empowering groups and training and skilling, what was all called its democracy training and so on. But what comes now, this was first this destabilization, and when we see now maybe a war zone right at the front gates, right at the gates of the European Union. So it's a very, very dangerous game which is played by the West in Ukraine. And when now, of course, the southern and eastern Ukrainians are asking for federation, or the more radical elements, they say, we want to have a reunification with Russia, we want to...
Okay, Dr. Skulte, if I can get your response to some of that there.
Okay. Well, earlier Manuel noted that Ukraine itself wasn't a particularly stable state, and I would agree with him. It's lacking what we would call real stateness, and therefore it's facing a number of these problems. You know, to whom are the military listening? You know, whom do they give their allegiance to? But in addition to that, I think that the points that Manuel made about CIA operatives, or even democracy promotion trainings in Ukraine, it is part, I wouldn't call it a proxy war, but of a competition of what type of system will exist in Ukraine. And I think that if we look to Russia right now, and we look to what thus far has been going on in Crimea, we can see that there's an alternative system, one where media is highly curtailed, one where NGOs are not allowed to receive any external funding. So I think we're seeing it at various levels, competition between a West and an East, as it were, that maybe will ramp up into a new Cold War. And unfortunately, Ukraine is the playing field for this competition.
Mr. Shoebridge, do you agree with that? Is Ukraine the new playing field between the Russians and the West? Is this a new Cold War in the making, if you will?
I don't think it's actually that new. If we look back even over the last 2 or 3 years, for sure, and even before that there has been competition for influence between Russia and its, if you like, its host parties, or its proxy parties. For example, the Party of Regions, the Communist Party within Ukraine, which are more of a pro-Russia slant. And then on the other hand, Batkivshina, other parties, UDAR more recently, which of course have been largely affiliated to the West. And indeed, then that fits, if you like, geopolitically from in terms of, for example, the alliances with the different populations within Ukraine. I mean, in my experience, and I have some experience of Ukraine over many years in terms of the political landscape, and actually being there and traveling around and speaking to ordinary people as well as politicians. And I have said consistently over this crisis that the vast majority of people, even in the east and south of Ukraine, for example, Odessa, in my experience, they want to stay part of Ukraine. Therefore, it's wrong to call them separatists, which they're widely called in the Western media. They want to stay part of Ukraine, but they want to have their traditions, their Russian language, their Russian culture, and their religion, of course, Russian Orthodox religion, respected by Kiev. And up to now, that has been the case. But since the new government has come into power, there is concern amongst those populations that none of those things are being respected. And indeed, the problem is that over the last few weeks, and perhaps this process will continue, that the way that the Kiev government has acted in its pronouncements, in its, if you like, dismissal of the interests and the concerns of those in South and East Ukraine, that it is in fact driving ordinary people actually into the hands of Russia by making them think that only Russia can protect them, that Kiev has got nothing, for example, to offer them. The Odessa fire, for example, last Friday, the terrible situation, the tragedy that happened there is an example in point. The Kiev government could easily set about with a thoroughly independent, rigorous investigation to catch those that carried out this terrible crime. But so far, I think people in Odessa and elsewhere really believe that justice in Ukraine is only for Ukrainians. It is not for the Russian minority, of course, the majority as it is in South and East Ukraine.
Yeah, Dr. Skulte, you called it democracy building earlier, but a lot of, well, pro-Russian elements in the country are suggesting that the Odessa fire and the massacre of those 40 pro-Russian activists is in fact the result of a Western military or intelligence presence on the ground, that this was a pre-planned operation designed to aggravate the Russians.
I think that that's mirror imaging is what we would call it theoretically. That as we've gone through this crisis, going from the toppling of Yanukovych all the way to the flagrant ridiculousness of, frankly, of the Crimean referendum. And further on, at each step, the Russian government has basically said, well, before we weren't quite telling the truth, but now we are. And so regarding something like that, it seems more to me that, again, a very inept Ukrainian police and fire that should have kept different protesters separated. And then fascist elements on both sides, and a tragedy ensued. To say that it's a CIA-led operation, I think, gives it much more of a focal point than is helpful, and again, re-inflames or refocuses that Russia wants to have part Novorossiya all the way into Transdniester, and is also threatening the Baltics.
Mr. Shoebridge, what do you think about that? I mean, is what we've seen in Odessa and this so-called anti-terrorist operation into eastern Ukraine, is it designed to drag Russia into some sort of military confrontation in Ukraine?
No, I agree with what your speaker just said. I don't think this was a plot by the West. One can almost see from the CCTV, from the video coverage of what happened last Friday in Odessa, the way that it developed. And one can see how that would develop. It's turned out to be quite embarrassing, of course, for the West. The EU and the US have given almost unlimited support to the Ukraine government, and yet the Ukraine government came out with some very bizarre comments in relation to this tragedy that took place, this crime that took place in Odessa. It's also the case that, of course, it's not in the West's interest to have Russia, for example, moving into Ukraine. And nor is it in Kiev's interest, because, of course, Russia could easily take those eastern provinces should they choose to do so. I think the problem comes, though, is that, as I've said earlier, that because of the way Kiev is reacting, what we've got here is a situation where in Odessa there seems to be a government in Kiev that doesn't care about the fact that these victims died in the way they did, that certainly it would appear that, notwithstanding what might have happened in clashes beforehand in the main streets of Odessa, what happened at that trade union building was largely a massacre of what appeared to be, in many cases, very peaceful demonstrators who had been at that location for a very long period of time, including women and very young people as well. And that in the eastern provinces, we've got on our television screens, even in the West, if you like, unavoidably, pictures of a government using its army against its own people. There are heavily armed people there on the pro-Russian side, it's true, but the vast majority of those people are ordinary people, very poorly armed, and in many cases just pure civilians pushing against tanks. And it's very interesting, I think, that certainly in the 2 days that took place after the Odessa fire, that on Western television screens, whether it was American, certainly, and British television screens that I was monitoring at the time, if you like, Ukraine disappeared somewhat from the screens, as if what has been happening in Odessa, what's happening in the east of Ukraine, and certainly the statements coming out of some parts of the government in Ukraine were something of an embarrassment to the West. So I think we've got now in a situation where, together with Putin's conciliatory remarks today, there is the potential, if both sides step back and both sides show willing to respect the other's point of view, that an agreement of sorts may be possible.
Dr. Skulte, will Washington's so-called containment policy that we've seen over the last couple of months as a result of this crisis work against today's Russia?
Well, it seems from economic specialists that no one really thinks that particularly the economic sanctions that have been put into place will be the sole reason that Putin would change course. However, Russia has suffered significantly due to those sanctions, that containment, financial containment. But the other things that they're putting into place...
But a lot of people will disagree with that. They are suggesting that these sanctions have been relatively ineffective up to this point.
Ineffective, but they have hurt Russia. Russia to date has lost at least $60 billion, all of the money, the same amount that was taken out of the country in 2013. This is the fourth year that it has seen slowed growth. It's only estimated to grow 1.3% this year. Those things damage a president that has really built his popularity on building Russia and making it a great power again. Again, will it push Putin and Russia to change course? Most seem highly doubtful on that. But again, all of the riling up of, the protection of the Russian people, of Russian culture, the greatness of the Russian nation, that very well could come back to haunt Putin inside of Russia, where there are definitely some quarters of society who are not happy with the way things are going.
Mr. Shoebridge, do you think that the sanctions are having an effect on Putin's way of thinking or policy making?
No, I don't. I think that the capital flows that have been mentioned, and indeed have been mentioned in the Western media, are part of a long-term trend. I mean, they haven't come about just because of sanctions. And also, of course, that position may well reverse. On top of that, there's a balance, of course, for Putin domestically that has to be struck between possible economic damage and political gain. I think the comment that's just been made by your studio guest is a valid one in respect of that he may be upsetting some people within Russia, particularly those perhaps who can fund election campaigns and so on. Oligarchs, of course, on all sides are as important in Russia as they are in Ukraine. But on the other hand, Putin has certainly lived up in his handling of this Ukraine crisis so far to the reputation that he wants to establish and has established within Russia as a protector of Russia's interests, of its greatness, as your previous contributor said, and indeed of looking after Russian people, even if they're not in, of course, Russia itself. Crimea is a great example of this. I mean, Crimea is something that was an open sore, if you like, for many years as a result of the circumstances of its handover to Ukraine in the first place. The fact that Russia itself, of course, has very great interests from a military strategic perspective in Crimea, and that, indeed, that has now passed to Russia pretty much without any consequences for Russia. And that is, of course, going to play very well for Putin domestically. And, of course, now for the West, there are more important fish to fry, shall we say, in terms of maintaining stability in East Ukraine. And, if you like, Crimea has been accepted as a fait accompli, as I think Putin imagined it would be. And that isn't, again, to criticize the West on this. It's just, as we say, a fait accompli, and Putin has been proved correct.
Yeah, let's not forget that Putin's approval rating has never been higher since this crisis started. That suggests that the majority of the Russian people do see eye to eye with their president when it comes to this issue.
And while everything that I've read would point to that being true, at the same time, over the past few years, media freedom has all but evaporated inside of Russia. And indeed, they just passed a law that makes even blogging, popular blogs, to be susceptible to oversight by the government. And I think what is really detrimental here is that many of the Russian people are not seeing anything except the government line on a number of issues.
Mr. Shoebridge, Russia throughout its history has been invaded by a number of great powers. Doesn't Putin's way of thinking when it comes to creating some sort of buffer zone around Russia make perfect sense?
Well, strategically it does, of course, and of course it's very important for Russia's interests that, first of all, that Crimea, the facilities there were maintained for the long term. That has been now maintained and established. But also, secondly, that Kiev and Ukraine, of course, should remain at worst neutral in terms of membership, for example, of NATO and perhaps even membership of the EU. It's important to remember, of course, that when Yanukovych agreed to sign a trade agreement with Russia and didn't sign the association agreement with the EU, it wasn't that wasn't created to be a permanent situation. Yanukovych was himself suggesting at points that there was no reason why Ukraine couldn't be in both camps, and that may well be where future interests lie. I think certainly when you look at, when you step back a bit in terms of geography and in terms of history, and you look at, from the Russian perspective, the advance of NATO, if you like, on Russia over the last 20 years, it's really quite profound, and I think it's had a quite profound effect on the thinking of the Russian people as a whole, let alone its government. When you look at the advance eastwards of NATO into places that formerly were parts of the Russian sphere, the Warsaw Pact and so on, and that's continuing, certainly into areas such as Kazakhstan, Georgia, Armenia, and places like this where traditionally Russia has had its influence, and now NATO, which of course has been very aggressively made itself a party to this dispute in Ukraine. For example, the Secretary General of NATO has made a number of speeches which certainly, if they'd been made by Russian generals and the heads of Russian military formations, would be billed as inflammatory in the West. And so consequently, from the Russian perspective, NATO is, I think, a threat to Russia. And when you look at the geography and the history, you can see why they would think that's the case.
Yeah, Manuel, I want to bring you back into discussion here if I can. Let's talk about NATO's expansion, continued expansion into Eastern Europe. Does that suggest that NATO really never stopped looking at Russia as an adversary?
Absolutely. We have to see the development of the last 25 years. And when we see that development on a map, on a Europe map, we see that NATO as well as European Union, don't forget the European Union, that they are pressing their border more and more towards east, towards Russia. And there were once very good Western-Russian relations, and these relations were under the President Yeltsin, for example. But with Putin it became worse. And why did it so? Because Putin refused the influence of NATO, of European Union in Russia, and he refused it very openly. And he was, if we want to say like that, dismantling those oligarchs in his country who were more or less agents, political agents of the West. And of course, he let those in power who were not, or who were pro-Russian. But when we see this border getting closer and closer to Russia, so we see that the reunification of Crimea with Russia was the first geopolitical blowback since 25 years, since the collapse of Soviet Union, which was described by Vladimir Putin as the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, or of the last century. And what is not so wrong if you see how much destabilization this collapse of this power brought. He didn't say, by the way, the downfall of communism. He said it was the geopolitical collapse of this system of power, which was all of the sudden away we had. And it's not so wrong if you look what we had after this. We had the bloody war in Yugoslavia. We had bloody wars in Transnistria, as well as between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We have a lot of unsolved conflicts all in this sphere, and these conflicts play a role all the time, because in those conflicts the West is playing a proxy role. In Georgia, in the Georgian war in 2008, of course the West was supporting the Georgian army and the Georgian state. In the Chechenian wars, of course, there was open Western support for the Chechenian terrorists. In Syria right now, where the Russian government is backing the legal Syrian government, is on the other side, the Western is backing the so-called rebels, who are in reality very often mercenaries and terrorists. So we see that.
Okay, if I can just get Dr. Skulte's thoughts on some of that there. Dr. Skulte, a lot of people have argued that, in fact, the Western response to the crisis in Ukraine is the result of Russia growing stronger and stronger, that the West feels intimidated by Russia's growth economically and militarily.
Well, I think it's more that Russia has felt the ability to try to stretch back into its imperial mold when it is gaining power. So that,
but we cannot deny the legitimate interests of the Russian nation when it comes to Ukraine, which are largely being ignored by the West.
Why are the interests of the Russian nation so much held in so much higher esteem as the legitimate interests of people of Ukraine voting in democratic elections on May 25th, for example? Or when we talk about NATO and EU expansion, from the Russian perspective, definitely you can see the border looming larger and larger. But I would argue for all of those countries that joined NATO in the EU, it was the attraction of free markets, of protection from Russia, and safety and security and prosperity that drew them west. And now when you see the fact that Russia had to actually go in and foment problems in eastern Ukraine, it's because it couldn't attract Ukraine in a way that would be similar to the EU.
Manuel, what are your thoughts on some of that? I mean, is Ukraine essentially, does Ukraine need to be protected from the Russians by integrating into the West?
Yes, if you ask Victoria in Newland, she would say yes, Ukraine has to be protected. But let's get to a more objective point of view. What Jennifer was saying is, in general, not so wrong. But go to Eastern Europe today and ask the people, ask them what they think today about the European Union. They will tell you that they were getting and hearing in the 90s a lot of lies what was happening. I was recently in Hungary. The people were told lies about what will become all better. They got the free market, but the free market brought just for the rich class and for what they then call today again the capitalists the good benefit. So when you say Russia is not attractive enough, we have to say that the reality is that the Western lobby groups and the Western marketing is much better maybe than the Russian one. And when we talk about NATO, it's very often when people say, yes, the NATO expansion, it was desired by the people. But we should go back. When the NATO was founded, the first general secretary of the NATO was Lord Ismay. And he was once asked, what is the purpose of NATO? And he said it has three purposes: to keep the Americans in Europe, to keep the Russians out of Europe, and to keep the Germans down in Europe. These are the three purposes of NATO. So let's take a look today if it changed. It keeps the Americans in. The Americans are increasing their presence right now. It keeps the Russians out. We have, with those things right now happening in Ukraine, and of course with NATO jet fighters coming to the Baltic states and so on, we have the pressure against Russia. And when we look for the last point, who is paying for all this? Who is the second largest payer of the NATO? This is Germany. And when Ukraine will collapse fully, and when there will be just a Western Ukrainian state, which will be not able to live on its own feet, who will pay for this? Who will have to bail out this entity? This will be also Germany. So you see, this tradition is going on until today. Of course, people don't want to mention this in mainstream media, but we see the red line going from the past to today and to the future.
Mr. Shoebridge, NATO has been struggling to find a new mission for itself since the end of the Cold War there. Do you think it's founded with Ukraine?
It's exactly the point I was just going to make, because it naturally follows on from what Manuel has just said. If you think about Afghanistan is winding down as far as the NATO perspective is concerned, and in other areas as well, NATO, if you like, has been casting around to find a role for itself beyond its more traditional role, which should be as a defensive organization, as a passive role. And so if you like, the Ukraine situation has come along in a very timely fashion to justify, if you like, NATO's existence and even its expansion, because now there is, once again, in inverted commas, the Russian threat. This is being mentioned on almost a daily basis by chiefs of staff and high officials within NATO and within NATO countries that bases have to be expanded, that, should we say, more troops, more aircraft, more resources stationed in an ever more easterly direction as a result of what Russia is alleged to have done. Well, Russia, of course, took Crimea, but of course Russia was based in Crimea anyway. Russia has not invaded East Ukraine, and if it did, I'm sure it would be under circumstances under which there would be a collapse of law and order there, where perhaps some massacres were taking place, and they would argue a responsibility to protect, just as the West has argued on many occasions. I want to go back to one other subject that is very important to bear in mind. It's just, again, stepping back from the situation and remember how things look to people in the east of Ukraine, in the south, and also in Russia, of course. And that is that it's very important to remember that when we talk about democracy in Ukraine, Ukraine was a democracy at the time of Yanukovych's overthrow. Sure, it was an imperfect democracy, as indeed are many countries in the world. But if you look at, for example, the OSCE's monitoring mission in 2010 at the election of Yanukovych, that election was judged to be, generally speaking, and certainly by Eastern European standards, free and fair. And so you had, no matter what way you look at it, you had a democratically elected president that was overthrown at the end of the day by a few tens of thousands of people on the street, many of whom were very, very violent, and the footage showed that, particularly amongst the right sector and others that we saw occupying buildings, attacking police, attacking the government generally, and deposing Yanukovych. It's true, of course, there were many hundreds of thousands of demonstrators on the streets of Kiev earlier on in a process when it was purely about whether to be in the EU. But Ukraine was a democracy. It is no longer a democracy because, of course, of the situation I've already mentioned with respect to the makeup of the parliament, and also the fact that it has an interim unelected government that is making very serious decisions at the moment, for example, using the army against its own people, for example, signing agreements with the EU, for which, of course, it has no democratic mandate. And it seems unlikely to a full degree that purely presidential elections, no matter how freely and fairly they are held, if that's possible in the circumstances currently pertaining, will change that.
Yeah, and a lot of what Mr. Shobridge mentioned there, Dr. Skulte, it begs the question, what kind of democracy does the West really want to see in Ukraine?
I think that they would ideally like to see some sort of normalized state. But as the situation unfolds, I think they're also realizing, I think as Manuel mentioned earlier, that they are dealing with and have long been dealing with a basket case. The levels of corruption, the ping-ponging back and forth of the presidents being pro-Russian, being pro-West. And so moving forward, I think maybe they're getting a little stuck in their positions that there needs to be a democracy along the lines of the West. And unfortunately, also the Russians are getting very stuck in their ways. And all of this could well mean the dismemberment of Ukraine, which would seem to serve very few people. But we may well have passed the time when there could have been some sort of Finlandization of Ukraine. And I don't know also if the Ukrainians themselves would have allowed such a thing.
Manuel, do you think that Ukraine is heading towards some sort of partition, Balkanization in the form of former Yugoslavia, perhaps?
I think we are right now in the middle of this process. I don't think it starts. I think we are in the middle. And when it comes to terms like democracy, freedom, human rights, we have to take into account that we talk here now about a geopolitical conflict where those terms lose any meaning. So when there is a referendum, for example, on Crimea, a referendum is the basic democratic activity what you can do. I'm 37 years old, I'm from Germany, I never had the right to take part at a referendum. So when there is a referendum, which is not in the interest of the West, the EU as well as the NATO and Washington will claim this is not a democratic legal act. So we see it's not about democracy, it's also always about the result, about what is coming out at the end. And for Ukraine itself, the best thing would be if you ask the people, instead of doing this presidential election, really if you do the referendums, if these people want to be part of the Ukraine, how they want this state, this entity to look like. Because the situation is somehow not so far away from, for example, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I have been just recently, where we have two entities, the Republika Srpska, which are the Serbs, and the the Croatian Bosnian Federation on the other side, which are the Croats and the Muslims there. And something like this could come out at the end of Ukraine. If this is good for Ukraine, if this is good for the people, this is another question. But it's very much obvious that the southern and eastern Ukrainians, I was talking in Crimea with the people there, it's everywhere visible. You can grab it in the air that these people want to have something else. They want to live in a central state governed from Kiev. And of course they feel close to Russia. They feel as Russians. And just as the last sentence, when I was doing their interviews, I was speaking to a lot of Ukrainians, not to Russians, Ukrainians, who were telling me that they hope for Russia or for being part of a Russian federal part of Ukraine. Why? We would ask, they didn't vote for Russia against Ukraine. They voted for stability and for security, also for social security, against the chaos and anarchy they see in Kiev. They have all relatives somewhere in Ukraine, and they tell already now there were pensions not paid out on bank houses. The people are panicking that the bank houses might close tomorrow. So all these things Russia was having during the neoliberal shock therapy in the 1990s, the people now in Ukraine are fearing, because they know from Russia what was there going on. And I think this is a very important point in those decisions which are made right now, which are completely silenced in Western media.
Mr. Shoebridge, that chaos that Manuel is talking about there, a lot of it has been prevented in Crimea thanks to the Russian military presence. Now, given the level of mistrust that exists between the different parties in Ukraine, will a Russian military presence be required in the eastern regions of Donetsk, for example?
Well, let's face it, a Russian military presence would be an invasion. Whatever one's position on the Ukraine situation, Ukraine is a sovereign country. It doesn't have a NATO guarantee, and it's important to remember that when we talk about the prospects of war, which of course makes it very different from the Baltic states, which a lot of people in the West like to compare it to. The Baltic states are members of NATO. This is a very different thing from a Russian intervention in Ukraine. But certainly, I think Ukraine occupation by its armed forces of a restive East is not a long-term solution, simply because, certainly in the current political situation, of a lack of federalization, for example, because it will be seen as an army of occupation. Already people are being killed there. Civilians are undoubtedly going to be killed or are being killed at the moment as well. This use of force, disproportionate use of force, some would argue, against what in many cases is ordinary people in the eastern Ukraine areas, will create bitterness that will last for some time, a generation or more, which will make it almost impossible for Ukraine to, if you like, govern those areas by consent if this current situation continues. And so really there is perhaps an opportunity really that is fast disappearing to actually have a Ukraine that's united with the consent of the majority of its people, particularly in those eastern and southern provinces, largely because of the actions of Kiev in using its armed forces in the way it is against the East rather than negotiating in any way. And secondly, by not treating, for example, the victims and the relatives of victims of the Odessa fire in a way that people imagine that had those victims been pro-Kiev demonstrators, that the perpetrators of that crime would have been pursued. There needs to be justice, equality, and if you like, equal rights for everybody, no matter what their ethnic origin in Ukraine. And the current perception is, and it's getting worse, that simply isn't the situation, certainly amongst the more Russian-leaning population.
Okay, on that rather pessimistic note there, I'm afraid that we have run out of time on this week's edition of the show. I would like to thank all of my guests, of course, right here in the studio, Dr. Jennifer Skulte-Ouaiss, a professor at the Lebanese American University of Beirut. From London, we had Mr. Charles Shoebridge. He is a security analyst. And from Berlin, Manuel Ockenstreiter, Berlin-based journalist. And thank you all for watching. Don't forget you can catch us again at the same time next week. Goodbye for now.
представителей Юго-Востока Украины.
We call on the representatives of southeastern Ukraine, the supporters of the federalization of the country, to postpone the referendum planned for May 11th this year.
В мае текущего года референдум.
Требовать мировое сообщество, выражаясь модным термином.
Once again gathering in the same format, when the opposition to the current regime in Ukraine is absent from the negotiating table. This will hardly change anything.